Good afternoon. I'm Keith Kellogg, the co-director for the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. 1 year ago today, we had the beginnings of the disastrous and embarrassing debacle of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. To be clear, I was for getting out of Afghanistan in a very deliberate and professional manner. How it occurred a year ago today was basically disturbing and disastrous. Today we're going to have two individuals who actually were part of the evacuation from a distance and involved actually at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Afghanistan a year ago. We're fortunate to be joined by former Congressman Scott Taylor, also a former Navy SEAL, and we're also fortunate to be joined by Joseph Robert III, who was also involved very closely with the evacuation of Americans and our SIV personnel from Afghanistan. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. Appreciate you being on with us.
Thanks for having us, General.
Thank you very much.
My first question to you on this 1 year anniversary is if you could you walk through in your own mind what you were seeing and what you were thinking when in the hours and the minutes during the evacuation from Afghanistan, and what specifically prompted you to take the step of saying, I'm going to do something about it and get involved? Scott, first to you.
Thank you, General. Well, I was actually in Turkey, I think, when it first started happening. And I remember looking at the news and just being like, oh my gosh, we're actually doing this right now. Why are we not keeping Kabul? Why don't we have a safe evacuation route from Kabul to Bagram, from Kabul to Bagram, from Kabul to HKaya. I was really concerned about it, and I had thoughts in my own mind about Yemen. I spent a lot of time in Yemen, and I was there during the Arab Spring and had to deal with trying to get private American citizens out when the protests were happening, and Ali Abdullah Saleh, the then leader, was having big problems in their big protests. So it brought my mind back to that. And then I got a call from a good buddy of mine named Robert Strict, who does some work there in DC. And we were talking about it. And, because he had been reached out to from a company that needed help in getting out of there. So then the same thing happened to me. I started getting text messages, started getting LinkedIn messages of folks that were stuck there that needed help. So then I immediately thought about calling up a friend of mine who runs Regulus Global, which was a government contracting logistics company that I'd worked with closely to bring in PPE during COVID. So I just knew that he had some contacts in the aviation world to be able to that others may not have. And I just felt like I need to get involved. I have a unique skill set, I have a unique network that kind of plays in both worlds and sort of that military, special forces, logistics, and overseas stuff, but also in the political world where I can help move things through. So we set up a talk. Regulus Global did, and then I put out something on LinkedIn, just said, hey, listen, we're trying to help out here. If anybody needs help in Afghanistan, please send a message. And I got to tell you, General, over the next, a few days, it was thousands of messages. I literally had to bring folks from my congressional campaign team in to get their information and contact them, because it was just overwhelming, the response, and people needed help. And that sort of started there. I just knew, listen, I think it's kind of an all hands on deck thing, whether you're in the military or not. But folks that had obviously time there and friends there and allies there, they needed to step up and help. So I didn't sleep for 3 weeks after that. So.
Hey, Joe, you were a former Force Recon, a Marine. You're also the CEO of the Black Feather Foundation. Can you give us your experiences, what happened that first day, and why did you get involved?
Yes, sir. Thanks again for having me on. Honored to be here and to share the experience with y'all. Much like Scott's story, it's, what you were seeing on television happening kind of took you by surprise. Like, oh my God, I can't believe we're watching this happen. And one phone call happens that triggers your involvement. And then in the same way, unique set of skills, relationships, resources suddenly became extremely valuable. So mine was, I have friends of mine, veteran friends of mine that had remained in the community through that, the tier 1 community with Special Forces, Navy SEAL, MARSOC, what have you, and had also continued on in other government agencies, contracting, what have you. So they remained in the field. And due to some of my unique relationships, I got called near the end of July, early August, by a good friend of mine who was trying to get out one interpreter and his family. And I had made the call to try and assist in acquiring a visa for that individual to get out. But the door, as we crept into the first 2 weeks of August, was rapidly closing. And that turned into hey, if we have this connection, do you think we could, expand this and see if we can't evacuate, another 1,500 people, anything we could? As Scott had mentioned, the calls just started flooding in to a level that was almost unmanageable. And we all scrambled together as many resources as we could. So I spoke to my contact or my relationship in the UAE on Friday, the 13th of August. And by August 15th, I was on a plane to UAE. So all of it happened over the course of a weekend. Realized, hey, we need to get over there. This isn't going to happen. We're all too familiar as veterans that our government is renowned for dropping the ball and leaving people behind and not being able to fulfill their commitments from what they had said. Yeah. So I think that's why you saw the veteran community hop to and immediately jump feet first in without any clearance from anybody or any plan. Just, we need to be there. We know what's going on over there, what it looks like. I've got the experience. We've got the know-how. We're just going to get over and start helping in any way we can. So over the course of the weekend, that developed. By August 20th, members of our team were on the ground in HKIA. I set foot on the ground on August 22nd, and to see the absolute chaos and lack of command and control at the airport was beyond anything I'd ever seen. And certainly in reflection from all those that operated with me in those closing weeks of August, even those that had deployed multiple times to Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, had never seen anything quite like that. The level of distress, fear, the conditions that they were staying in those days as they were piled up outside the walls of HKIA, just a disaster front to back. There's very few other ways to describe it. And then once we got into it, realized what an asset we were and how short the American effort was going to fall. So we just kept pushing on. So that very similar stories. Each of us brought our own skill sets, resources, and relationships into the mix, and combined effort collectively. I think this would not have been pulled off if it weren't for the selfless efforts of the largely veteran community to jump right in and throw their tool bags into the mix to get this done.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look, I'm going to ask you, Joe, and then turn out to Scott as well. All of us were here back in the United States looking at the pictures we saw coming out of HKIA with the massive amount of people running alongside of aircraft, some of them hanging onto aircraft and falling off as they gained altitude, but also the inside of those aircraft. And the first aircraft we saw here in the United States and the inside were almost all male. And they were not, I used to believe there was women and children first, and then we didn't see the males, until they came later. But that was just the opposite we saw. What kind of vetting process was there initially, and how were you able to control who left Afghanistan as the process went on? Joe, over to you first.
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, I believe there was an attempt at command and control and to have a vetting process. DOD had something in place where they did a basic vetting. And then they would manifest them with these white bracelets. Unfortunately, around the 24th, sir, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was around the 24th, somebody had the bright idea to essentially open the outer gates, the perimeter gates, and the population of Afghans inside of the airport swelled from roughly 5,000 to nearly 20,000 in like 24 hours. At that point, all command and control was gone. All vetting systems were gone. It became a fire sale. Everybody leaves the airport, no matter who they are. And then it just was a load and go, a security pat down. Okay. That was it. I mean, I found children playing with grenades on the jet plank before loading the aircraft with bags. That's how poorly the security was there at that point. But due to lack of command and control, the rapidly closing window, and the the close to 20,000 Afghans inside that wall, there was no control, no vetting. It was just everybody that's here, just get everybody out. And if you're outside the wall, sorry, you don't go.
Yeah. Scott?
I think what he's saying is 100% correct, and I think you have to take a step back and look at what led to that. And as we talked about a little bit early here, the decision and you have to, the responsibility of this decision was in the chain of command, of course, no question about it. It was the president made a decision, and the military did as best they could to try to execute that his orders. But in doing so, of course, as we talked about, there was no safety corridor from Kabul to Kaya, no safety corridor. They didn't keep Kabul. They didn't keep Bagram. No safety corridor there. So there was lack of command and control before it even started. And then and as you know, General, you want to have those systems in place before the things hit the fan, because when they hit the fan, it's way too late, and that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, you had the car bomb, which made it even worse. And initially, General McKenzie was talking about how they wanted to have the Taliban 15, 20 kilometers outside of Kabul. Well, obviously, after that happened, when he arrived, Taliban was already in Kabul, right? And then they tried to implement their own command and control, and they weren't communicating. And I mean, it was a nightmare, quite frankly. And I want to say this as well, because I think Joe brought it up with the government. The government was not prepared for this. The orders didn't come down for the military to have those secure lanes, but also consular services as well. You spoke about vetting. They were absolutely had inefficient numbers to do any kind of vetting from consular service and State Department. And early on, when this first started happening, we first started getting involved in laying on private aircraft. And I talked to the NSC, at the highest level of NSC, and said, "Hey, listen, we have these aircraft here. We're ready to help in any way. What do you want us to do?" And the first thing they do is, here's the email to the State Department's task force. Yeah. Do you think that they ever email back? Not once. They did not email back one time. And then, of course, I get another contact right on the ground there, who was the commander controlling the airflow. And same thing. Hey, commander, look, whatever you need, we're here. We have private air. We can we can come in there. We can take whoever you want out. And they said, awesome. Let's do that. And that came from a CIA agency contact. To get them. They called me on a secure phone. They were ready to go. Then they got the orders from the White House. No private planes. So then, as Joe just pointed out, the airport swells because there wasn't movement. Like there was bureaucracy and no movement and no not insufficient staff at the State Department. And as fearful human beings doing whatever they could to survive to get out of there. Right. So no movement on private air. They stopped us. And then, of course, the airport swells. I get a call from the commander again on signal a day or two later. You still have those planes? Because, we have 15, 20,000 people in the airport. We got to move it through. And we're like, yeah, what do we need to do? And then I think the president came on TV, and then the order came down. They stopped it again. I think that there was obviously poor prior planning here. But the responsibility certainly falls on the chain of command all the way up to the president.
Yeah. Both of you served in special units. Scott, you were in the Navy SEALs, and Joe, you were in the Marine Force Recon. And when I was in the military as well, we always had a kind of a motto of our own where we said we would leave no one behind. We would always make sure we got our friends and allies out. And yet the concern we had when we here back in the United States watching it, not only were we leaving Americans behind, but we were leaving those that had fought with us in Afghanistan and who had SIVs, who had been vetted to come back. And what is your take on those we left behind? Scott, first to you, and how are we getting those people out that are still there, that have special immigrant visas, and we're trying to get them back here in the United States?
Well, let me preface this by saying, like you and like Joe, look, I've listened to Amazing Grace played on the bagpipes too many times at funerals, and including my best friend who was killed in Afghanistan. And, quite frankly, when you see the failure to hold up our end of the bargain for these folks who kept them safe, saved their lives many, many times, who still, by the way, I talked about all the thousands of LinkedIn messages and somebody also gave my cell phone out in Kabul. So I still get messages on my cell phone now. But even today, I got a message on LinkedIn, someone saying, please, sir, I work for, L3. Can you, evacuate me, please? And it's devastating. It's heartbreaking. There are literally thousands of veterans across this United States who are hopeless right now because they can't help those people who fought beside us, who may or may not have saved their lives throughout the 20 years. I mean, it's a massive, profound break in commitment. And as you said, against the ethos that all three of us, have ingrained in us. And so one more thing, when you talked about, all the lack of vetting and all the folks that came to the airport, this is also something we knew if this decision was coming down. And in general, with all due respect, I think that at the flag level, obviously they advised the president, he made the decision, but someone should have resigned. I mean, someone should have said, listen, Mr. President, we know what's going to happen. And, people are going to be fearful for their life. The Americans are leaving. That means no security. There's going to be a bum rush to get out of there, and people will be left behind. And some of the people that saved American lives, and they will be executed. They will be hunted. They will be executed by members of the Taliban in many respects. And someone should have put their papers right on the president's desk and say, I will not be a part of this unless we do it, as you said, deliberately and with prior planning to be able to save the lives that we needed to save. And we didn't do that. It's a big failure.
Yeah. Good point, Scott. Joe, what about your thoughts on that?
Sir, this is, I think it all goes back to the very beginning. The lack of preparation leading into this is the result, or has resulted in the tens of thousands of people being left behind, whether they're Americans, SIVs, or just those now that had been working and taking advantage of the limited freedoms that they did have under, as flawed as it was, the government that had been in existence there over the past 2 decades in U.S. guidance. And then to have all of that just pulled out from under them, you put every single one of those people now at risk for even taking advantage of those opportunities, particularly women, journalists, those that are in the field of government, and then obviously the ones that supported us more directly. But, the lack of command and control and prior planning in the beginning, they had originally, I believe the number is roughly 80,000 were evacuated in August. Does that sound about correct, if I'm not mistaken?
In that range.
But those weren't the 80,000 people that we were supposed to get out. They were just the 80,000 closest to the front gate of the airport. So now you've evacuated, let's say it's definitely more than 50%. But even with that number, you've imported 40,000 just random Afghans that are in Kabul that is surrounded by Taliban. They were standing and walking on the perimeter of the airfield. It's not like there was any breathing room between the exterior wall and where Taliban started. And the lack of command at the gates, the people that we were trying to get through, well, as soon as you call or identify them, well, now they're identified to everybody, the Taliban and the 10,000 plus people in between you and where the gate is. And everyone's jealous. Everyone wants that spot. So you're putting people consistently at risk, even while you're trying to evacuate them. Our team ultimately provided 17 aircraft and moved roughly 6,000 people in August out. But then afterwards, they wouldn't process them because they said, well, not our plane, not our problem. Well, you gave me the authorization to assist and help. And I couldn't evacuate the people that were targeted because you made us load everybody. So now we're stuck in a position post-August where all these NGOs are doing everything they can to frantically help identify, locate, move, secure, manifest, and get and evacuate the people that we should have evacuated in the first place. And it's been us chasing our tail while the government, excuse me if it delayed, while the government is trying to build the ship after it's set sail, unfortunately, and everyone else around it has been sitting in lifeboats, doesn't even know how to collect or provide service because there is no coordination, cooperation, or clarity on what the government's doing. And that seems to be at every level internally within the administration and State Department specifically. And
you bring up a really good point about the coordination or the lack of coordination and planning for this. Have either one of you, and first go to you, Joe, has the government, this administration, called the NGOs in or anybody else in to talk about lessons learned. All of us have gone through after action reviews, prepare for the next fight, prepare for the next issue. Have they brought you in, and how do we record these lessons learned that we don't let this happen again? I hate to date myself, but I actually go back to the extraction we had in Vietnam out of Saigon, which wasn't really very well done. And then you look at what happened here at Karzai. Has anybody talked to you about that, or how should we go about making sure that this doesn't happen again within any government circle? Joe, first you.
Yes, sir. No, and this may just be me personally, because my focus has largely been through the UAE and not, those that are going through Doha or elsewhere. But I know that there's a point of contact through with State Department through the Afghan evac coalition. I'll be perfectly honest. I feel that that's a way to manage NGOs, not necessarily a way to cooperate and coordinate with them. They have been reluctant to do anything with me in EHC. They have tried their damnedest to ignore this place. They tried to pack up after they processed the 5,000 that arrived on U.S. aircraft back in December. Were unable to do that as, the voices got too loud from the NGO community, from, I'm sure, the Emiratis as well, saying, like, hey, where do you think you're going? The Afghans raising up and making their voices heard as well. And those with State Department operating on the ground, seeing who's there, seeing the makeup of the population, say, hey, we've got people here that deserve to be moved on. But there's no desire. There doesn't seem to be a desire to learn about what went wrong here. It seems very deliberate, both the disaster of the withdrawal and the continuing refugee crisis that's been created by it. I can't view it as anything other than that was the intent. Find a way to just make this whole Afghanistan thing disappear. And they've not been able to do so. And they've not even made any corrective measures to course correct. Even today, this just happened this morning. I'm trying to find all the SIV cases that are in UAE still. Roughly 300 active cases, which are connected to with their family members. Roughly 1,000 people. And as we present those cases to State Department to run through to see where we can assist and advance their cases so they can be processed, as they highlight those, we find out that the task force has already moved them to the United States. So we continue to spin our wheels even now to do work for people that supposedly have no case, but then they get swept up by the United States. And so we're watching folks from EHC specifically that have no case being processed and moved on to the United States with SIVs, with P1, P2. But then there's a plethora of those in each category that remain behind. But for what reason? There's no clarity. So how do we focus our efforts to help if you can't even tell us what you're doing? It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna, if it's okay, I want to just have one little alibi on the last question with the Taliban, and I think that Joe brought it up. He brought it up, and it's extremely important, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of folks, whether they were SIVs or they were at-risk folks, and they didn't come to the airport because. Right about the time after the bomb, when the Taliban came in, and as Joe pointed out, there was not a lot of daylight between their security checkpoints and then U.S. security checkpoints. Yeah. And it's even worse than that because, we were helping about 300 folks come out, these women who came to the gate, and I was dealing directly with one of the Army captains who was running the gates, and he walked me through what they had to do. And so what they had to do was print off a list of manifests. And then he drove out to the Taliban to negotiate with the Taliban to get approval on the names on the list, which of course then they had the list. So you heard about reporting all the Biden administration is giving lists to folks. And they were like, no, we're not. But they kind of were because they had to give the Taliban these manifests who they had to negotiate to see if they could get through. So of course, if you're, someone who fought against the Taliban and the Afghan army, you're not super happy about getting your name out there, right? As you said, you're at risk. And they had those lists when we left, when the last flight flew out. So what do you think happened afterwards? Not a good thing, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to say that because I don't think most Americans understand that at some point during this evacuation, we were subservient to we gave them a veto on who was able to leave. For Americans, which is incredible. And I don't know if that's ever been done before. But anyways, so I think that Joe also said something that I can expound upon a little bit, because of course I play in that special forces and the political world. So the political piece here, I think that the president made a decision, and he wasn't far off, that I think the American people were done. They were done with Afghanistan. As you said when you first started, General, I'm with you. I think it was time, and in closing, I'll talk about why. But it had to be done in a deliberate way, which of course wasn't. But I think he made a political decision that we're done with Afghanistan. Americans are done with it, and then afterwards, we're not talking about it, right? We're not talking about it, which of course causes massive problems in lessons learned, and actually verbalizing and socializing and talk about these lessons learned so that they get embedded within State Department, DOD, the executive branch, so that we don't make these mistakes again. In Yemen, when that was happening, when we called the RSO, the security officer at the embassy, hey, what's the plan? We're going to be evacuating American citizens. What's the plan? Where do we go? They're like, we don't have a plan. You're like, what do you mean you don't have a plan? Like, what are you talking about? And so thank God that person got fired. But my point is, it's never talked about, but it has to be. And quite frankly, it needs to be at the congressional level. They need to hold State Department, DOD, they need to hold their feet to the fire to make sure that they're coming up with lessons learned that can be embedded throughout. And quite frankly, because you had an administration that wanted to turn the page, not talk about Afghanistan because of elections, because it was bad for them. They had a willing Congress controlled by the same political party who also didn't have hearings and investigations, which was it's necessary to do. It's ugly, it's painful, but it will save American lives and our allies' lives in the future if we do it, and it's necessary to do.
Yeah. Look, this has been an incredible conversation, because a lot of things have come out that I think all Americans kind of felt in their hearts, which just what both of you are saying and what you've done. In closing this discussion, what I would like to ask you a final comment, and since Scott got the first question, Joe, you get to answer this one first, then over to Scott. At the end, what would you say are the primary lessons learned? I think you kind of said it during the course of the discussion, but again, in closing, what do you think the best lessons learned for us in the U.S. government, the U.S. military, on this debacle which happened in Afghanistan, which started a year ago today? Joe, thoughts?
So obviously there are a number of aspects of this that could be improved upon and focused. But I think the one long-term thing that I've seen over the course of this entire year, so not focusing on just the withdrawal and the aftermath, but broadly speaking, because of the magnitude of what this whole thing was, from the planning or lack thereof for the withdrawal to the management of the evacuation itself, and the follow-on fallout of the immigration or the refugee crisis, and what to do with all these people and how to prepare systems and to have them embedded prior to needing them. Is there internally, the U.S. government needs to do a much better job of cooperating with themselves. State Department doesn't talk to Department of Homeland Security. No, Department of Homeland Security doesn't coordinate with DOD. And yet every one of these departments was, paramountly involved in this. DOD had a role. It was all of their stations that were being utilized, their aircraft. State Department is the one that's largely in charge of all the processing for the SIV and P1, P2 categories. Department of Homeland Security is the authorizer, ultimately, of everyone who enters the country and has the ability to use the port parole system. So, but no single agency took command and control. There was no overarching organizational structure. And because all of this was developed ad hoc, you had individuals from varying departments that were volunteering their time to assist in, various areas around the world to help facilitate this process. And they couldn't even get access to the systems that were utilized, because each aspect of this within each department is pigeonholed to, you only have access to what you're required to know. So there's no ability to quickly open up engagements in a massive multi-agency evolution such as this. So I think that's the biggest one, is it really highlights the inefficiency of government to work with itself.
Yeah, Scott.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, again, thanks so much for having us. This has been a great conversation for sure. Strategically, I think along the way in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, shortly after we overthrew the Taliban, I think America, we lost our way. We veered off the path of why we were there in the first place and what we were trying to accomplish. And we started to believe and act to impose a Western-style government in Afghanistan, and to think that we could actually set up sort of a Westphalian nation state in the way that we understand it to be here in the West. There's a millennia of history and culture and religion that made it impossible in Afghanistan, and certainly in other areas that all three of us have been to. In addition to what Joe said, tactically, in addition to what he said, I think commanders in the field were sort of incentivized to show progress in training and training the Army for advancement, for example, or the private sector was financially incentivized to keep this mirage going. Our leaders in Washington, they were politically incentivized, despite spending, taxpayer dollars and sending troops, and they were talking tough on terrorism, anti-terrorism rather. But there was all these, I think, misplaced incentives that kept this going for 20 years. And now with the current administration, while they're incentivized to forget what happened last year, I think it's going to continue to get worse for the people who are still left behind in Afghanistan before it gets better. And I think the horror, the helplessness and heartache will continue to haunt those of us who lost brothers and sisters there, and who lost our own blood and youth, and who are still have allies trapped there, and who are still trying to do the great work that Joe and others are doing, and trying to help folks get out of whether it's refugee camps or process their SIV applications. It's my hope that we will learn lessons from this moving forward, so that it doesn't happen again, or at least in a much better way if it ever does happen. But I fear that we may not learn those lessons.
Yeah, thank you. Look, for those of you watching today, we have been joined by two great Americans, and these are two Americans who've sacrificed time and energy, financial support, to support getting Afghans and Americans out from that debacle that we had a year ago today. So Scott Taylor, former congressman, great member of SEAL Team 2, thank you. For Joe Robert III, thank you very much. The CEO of Black Feather Foundation, thank you both. You're both great Americans. Thank you for joining us today, and I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. They were magnificent. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.